bistvu ne bom vas predolgo motila, imam dve vprašanji za vas. Najprej me v bistvu zanima, kaj vas je sploh navdihnilo za raziskovanje arhiva Dušana Grabrijana in mogoče na kratko o njegovem arhivu, pa o zbirki v muzeju, ki jo imate.
Ja. Zdaj ne vem, če veš, ampak jaz sem po končanem študiju arhitekture zaprosil za štipendijo francoske vlade in sem bil eno leto v Parizu in sicer pri profesorju Vladimirju Veličkoviču. Ne vem, če ti to ime kaj pomeni, ampak to je veliko ime grafike in risanja, drugače pa profesor tudi arhitekt, čeprav se je ukvarjal s slikarstvom. In že takrat me je ta profesor nekako usmeril, da pogledam, ker sem jaz tudi bil arhitekt, oziroma sem še, da pač si pogledam stvari od Le Corbusierja. Šel sem v to fundacijo in si vse, kar je bilo možno v okolici Pariza, ogledal. Potem sem pa prišel nazaj, sem delal v enem biroju. V tem biroju je bil tudi arhitekt Viktor Pust, ki je študiral ne samo v Ljubljani, ampak tudi v Parizu pri arhitektu Candilisu, ki je delal s Corbusierjem. Tako da, pa tudi v gimnaziji sem se učil francoščino, ne, tako da pa pol v Parizu sem to še malo izboljšal in tako naprej. Skratka, jaz sem s tem Corbusierjem, kako bi rekel, kar dobro seznanil. In potem, ko sem po vseh teh tranzicijskih zadevah, ki so bile v 90-ih letih, ne, pa to sem iz projektive, ne, kjer sem bil zaposlen v enem arhitekturnem biroju, potem se odločil za podiplomski študij. Sicer sem nekako se usmeril v to stanovanjsko problematiko in finance v arhitekturi in podobno. No, in potem po moji disertaciji sem bil nekaj časa novinar, potem sem se pa zaposlil v muzeju. In meni se je to dejstvo, ne, ker sem že slišal nekoč, da je za Grabrijana sem slišal že na šoli, seveda, ne, in da se je on tudi navduševal nad idejami Corbusierja, sicer je živel v Bosni, pa se je ukvarjal tudi s to vernakularno arhitekturo in temi zadevami. In jasno, da me je pol ta tema, pa ta arhiv sta me zelo pritegnila, ne. In takrat smo angažirali približno 10 prostovoljk in sta na tem projektu popisovanja arhivskih škatel in gradiva delali predvsem dve prostovoljki, Katja Logar pa Gruden Vesna. No, in smo pol to popisovali nekaj časa, to gradivo. Jaz sem bil pač tle kusto zaposlen in sem pač nadziral to delo. In smo pol naredili jaz sem prišel v muzej konec leta 2005, čez dobra 3 leta pa smo naredili eno tako predstavitev, kaj smo naredili, popisali in tudi eno tako mini razstavico o Grabrijanu. In pol iz tega naprej, ne, sem naredil tudi knjigo Plečnikovi študenti pri Corbusierju. Ne vem, če veš, ampak je bilo slovenskih arhitektov, je bilo med vsemi arhitekti iz celega sveta, je bilo največ, ne, ob francoskih arhitektih in švicarskih. To pa veš, da je bil Corbusier Francoz iz Švice, ne, in pol, glej, na 3. mestu smo Slovenci in to je mene tako, kako bi rekel, fasciniralo, ne. A veš, da imamo tako močno zasedbo. In pa sem rekel, ja, sej, če jih je bilo pa toliko tam, mora biti pa ta modernizem zelo močen, ga mora biti zelo veliko prisotne te arhitekture, vplivov Corbusierja. In sem pol raziskoval to temo in sem ugotovil, da so bili v bistvu oni, ki so bili pri Corbusierju, te Plečnikovi študenti, pa tudi drugi Slovenci, da so bili precej kritični, da niso tako, kot se danes reče, copy-paste, tako brez kakšnega kritičnega vpogleda prenašali te ideje sem, in da so hoteli pač v to svojo arhitekturo, ki je bila tudi pod vtisom, bi rekel, Plečnika, pa te Plečnikove šole in tako naprej, so skratka zelo z eno distanco prenašali te ideje, in pač sem to pol skušal v tem strokovnem miljeju nekako čim bolj poudariti, da je to pomembno za slovensko arhitekturno zgodovino.
So, when writing about the concepts of distant and close-to-home Orients in the Austro-Hungarian differential discourse, did you ever struggle with how much to emphasize its lingering influence on modern perceptions of Bosnia, or did the historical sources naturally push you in that direction?
Okay, I will say a few words about it, and Aida can add to it. I would say that initially we were not so influenced by historical sources in positioning distinct perception of two Orients in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, as by historical informal knowledge. So this separation of two Orients, of foreign Muslims on the one side against indigenous Bosnian Muslim on the other, was widely spread informal and local knowledge, internal knowledge and narrative, and it was circulating among natives, among Bosnian Muslims, as long as the infamous fight of Bosnian Muslim for autonomy in the 19th century. So, of course, this division was also present in the Austro-Hungarian intellectual milieu. So there was a little doubt when we started to write the article that any modern architectural work dealing with Ottoman legacy would fail into this ambivalent circuit of distinction between our and foreign Orients. And the question was how to accommodate it into a neutral context that discarded the notions. So we just looked for the theory. We knew that such a distinction exists, and it still exists in Bosnia and Herzegovina and such. And as I said, it is some kind of informal knowledge. And we looked for the theory that reinforced and framed this knowledge, and we came across this theory of Heiss and Weitinger that scholarly comprehensively present this theory. So they just put this in a scientific frame, this theory that was already known during the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and subsequently. So Neidhardt and Grabrijan themselves were born in and grown up in Austro-Hungarian monarchy in these circumstances, and without any doubt, they were acquainted with such ambience. And when we looked for such split in their understanding of Bosnian Islamic autochthon tradition, we easily found this. We could discern it right away when we looked in their book Arhitektura Bosne put u savremeno. So I would say that this was an easy task because they produced theoretical source that was the basis for architectural production. But problem with other modernist heritage that is informed by Ottoman tradition is that we don't have such a prolific writings, theoretical sources that that Grabrian and Neidhardt produced for their as some kind of manifest for their architectural production. I would say that in other modernist production that confronts Islamic tradition, we have to go through other in different direction by looking of architectural buildings and not of theories. So that would be in short what I have understood that was your question. And I can recommend you a book by Maria Todorova, Imagining Balkans. So she presents this distinction of perception, not only of Ottoman heritage, but of Balkan heritage that was connected with Ottoman. And her anthological book, Imagining Balkans, that is also cited in our work for making the basis for our arguments.
It is a question that is in some way very obvious to us, but on the other hand, it becomes very complex once you try to think about it. It is obvious to us because we have the lived-in experience of this phenomena, and we all have our own relationships with this interpretation of Bosnian Muslims during the Austro-Hungarian times and even later. So I'm kind of, let's say, for the article, of course, as Lejla explained, we were led instinctively, but then supported through literature. But I would like to emphasize to you that is kind of, at least in my perception, quite a complex question, because it's difficult to look very objectively upon yourself. So we have these theories and the people who wrote about Bosnia who are not from here in these cases where we mentioned the theory of distant and close neighbor. So I'm saying that for me there is still some complexity and ambiguity in that regard. But as far as the architectural discourse, I think that Juraj Neidhardt and Dušan Grabrijan also through their book show a level of, for me at least, when I read into it, show a level of awareness which is rather high in that sense, where they have the enough sensibility to also realize and I think perceive and understand this problem, even though maybe some things come to them naturally or either through research, through architecture. So as for some later periods of socialist or modernist architecture, I think this question becomes again in a way relevant and has a similar, I can say, once again similar answer in architecture and also in theory.
Told me plenty and it was all great, so thank you very much.
It seems like an interesting project that you take the articles and analyze them, so you've given us some good ideas.
I've read your text from the Komomo Journal number 72 about Sarajevo and its satellites. And during the reading, it came to my mind that all these ideas from Grabrijan and Neidhardt about new settlements, about Baščaršija, may have been influenced by ideological or political pressures from the system of the time. After all, Tehnički vjesnik, where they presented their ideas, was published in the year 1942 during the World War II. So how did the influence of political and social changes in these times shape the architectural and urban planning decisions of Grabrijan and Neidhardt?
Okay, thanks, Tim. Good question, really, because architects and artists respond to political and social context of their time in many different ways. What I think makes this particular response unique is the integration of Ottoman and Islamic architectural heritage in their discussion on Bosnian Oriental vision, which later on in their second book became a most prominent vision for Bosnian modern architecture. What I have argued in this text is a kind of try to demonstrate how their architectural ideas developed from initial, when they came to Bosnia, first Grabrijan, then Neidhardt, and responded to context, social and political context, how their architectural ideas developed gradually to kind of eventually mold into this vision of Bosnian Oriental modern architecture, which they became very famous for and became main protagonist of. Up until this day, and the whole issue talks about the ideas of Bosnian Oriental architecture. In the first vision, which is discussed in this text, Sarajevo and its satellite, I'm arguing that the ideas were not really aligned with the political and social vision, or maybe there was no clear political and social vision at the time. They in a way shy away from Baščaršija as such. They look at modern and new developments outside. Neidhardt was a very enthusiastic architect. He seemed to have responded, enthusiastically to many tasks. He participated later on during socialism in public debates and so on. Grabrijan, on the other side, was more focused on history and was more focused on kind of deliberation, maybe writing. So the combination between two was a very productive one in terms of architectural discussion, design, and philosophical or theoretical discussions of what would be a Bosnian Oriental architecture, or what kind of response is the most significant for that time. So in the first vision of Sarajevo and its satellite, I would argue that Neidhardt, who already worked with Le Corbusier and was very much in tune with the modernist ideas, could see potential in Bosnian Oriental in a sense of, like Le Corbusier spoke about it, but Le Corbusier's vision much later, was criticized for that kind of Orient-Occident duality. And I think some of those ideas are present in the first iteration of Sarajevo's regulation plan, which is presented in Sarajevo and its satellite. And the ideas gradually molded and kind of transformed to change this kind of Oriental expression as an integrated vision of spiritual but significantly spiritual values, but embodied in Bosnian Oriental architecture. And as you well know, Oriental heritage was always contested in Bosnia, was contested in the whole region for its connection to the Ottoman Empire and colonial period. So I think they would, strictly speaking, responding to the question, did they respond to political and ideological? I think architects do anyhow in various ways. I would not say that they specifically responded to it kind of consciously, but subconsciously or kind of by context responding to the questions raised. I think they were aware that, and I would argue that by the time they published second book, Sarajevo, like a vision of modern architecture for Bosnia, by that time the ideas of integration of Ottoman and Islamic heritage with the modern were very much developed further than in their initial plans.
Okay, thank you.
Torej, Grabrijan je veliko dal na simboliko nagrobnika, kakšna je simbolika odprte knjige, ki jo najdemo na njegovem nagrobniku, in kakšno vlogo igrate upodobitev roke in ravnila? Gre za osebno metaforo, simbol poklica ali nekaj širšega?
Grabrijan je umrl leta 1952. V bistvu je bilo kar tragično, ker je šlo za neko operacijo, dosti rutinsko, in po tej operaciji so sledile neke nepričakovane komplikacije. In potem je umrl. Avtor njegovega nagrobnika, tega nagrobnika, kjer je prikazana odprta knjiga, roka in pa ravnilo, je arhitekt Niko Bežek. Niko Bežek je bil Grabrijanov dober prijatelj in predvidevam, da je v bistvu ta simbolika odprte knjige, ravnila in roke nek najlepši prikaz tega, kar je Grabrijan bil kot arhitekt, kot človek, kot raziskovalec. Leta 1957, ko je šla ta znana knjiga Architecture of Bosnia and the Way Towards Modernity, je na začetku Juraj Neidhardt objavil tudi svojo skico Grabrijanega nagrobnika in tudi tam je prikazana ta odprta knjiga. Tako da mislim, da so to nekako dogovorili mogoče med sabo njegovi prijatelji in da so bili dejansko vsi nekako mnenja, da ga ta odprta knjiga kot nekega raziskovalca arhitekture najbolj predstavi. Toliko.
Okay. In če gremo na drugo vprašanje. Kakšen vpliv je imel Plečnik na Gabrijanovo ustvarjanje, zlasti pri natečaju, na katerem je Grabrijan zmagal z osnovo nagrobnika? Kako je Grabrijan gledal na Plečnikovo arhitekturo, upoštevajoč, da so jo sodobna gibanja, kot sta Bauhaus in Scion, pogosto zavračala?
Plečnik je imel na Grabrijana absolutno zelo, zelo pomembno vlogo. Grabrijanu je oče umrl zelo zgodaj, tako da je najbrž nekako povzel Plečnikovo vlogo kot neko tudi očetovsko vlogo. Vemo, da je bil Grabrijan med prvimi 3 Plečnikovimi diplomanti, poleg Tomažiča in Faturja. In so si tudi dopisovali iz teh pisem, razglednic je razvidno, da je prav pri temu natečaju za nagrobnik modernistom Plečnik Grabrijanu sugeriral neke forme. Svet form je bil za Plečnika zelo pomemben. Grabrijan pa se je že v bistvu v tistem času, on je leta 1925 po diplomi pri Plečniku šel tudi v Pariz na študij za 1 leto, je dobil štipendijo in se je tam seznanil tudi z delom Pereja, Le Corbusierja in drugih modernistov in se mu je zdel ta svet form nekako neprimeren za tisti čas. Tako da je v bistvu prišlo do neke dihtonomije, ne samo med Grabrijanom in Plečnikom, ampak med celo generacijo teh Plečnikovih študentov, ki so potem po letu 1925, ko so pod vodstvom Tomažiča, ki je bil takrat prvi Plečnikov asistent, študenti obiskali razstavo v Parizu, potem prišli nazaj in prosili Vurnika, če oblikuje svoj seminar, ki je bil pa bolj funkcionalistično oziroma bolj racionalno usmerjen. Tako da je že v samem začetku, Plečnik je začel učiti leta 1921 na fakulteti za arhitekturo in je že v samem začetku prišlo do neke te dihtonomije. Po eni strani izrazito spoštovanje Plečnika kot osebnosti, njegovega dela, njegovih pristopov, po drugi strani pa precej močne kritike, predvsem v zvezi z duhom časa. Duh časa je zahteval neke nove odzive, drugačne pristope, kot jih je zagovarjal Plečnik. Pri tem moramo pa vedeti, da v Sloveniji v tistem času, da je bilo v bistvu, da ni bilo še gradbene industrije, ne? In da je nekako logično, da se je Plečnik naslonil na tradicijo umetne obrti, ki je bila pa tukaj zelo močno razvita, ne? Tako da je Plečnikov pristop sloni na povezavi z umetno obrtjo, medtem ko se je ta industrija gradbena pri nas razvila šele v povojnem času. In takrat so pa potem Plečnikovi diplomanti kot Edvard Travnikar razvili na podlagi Plečnikove šole pač neko novo arhitekturo povojnega modernizma, ki ga sama imenujem tudi avtentični modernizem. Tako.
Pogosto se ob odkritju starih načrtov, nerealiziranih projektov, pojavi pobuda za realizacijo. Ali menite, da bi kateri od Plečnikovih nerealiziranih projektov lahko deloval v kontekstu današnje družbe?
To je delikatno vprašanje. Jaz sem gotovo privrženec tega, da je naloga vseh, ki se ukvarjamo s proučevanjem, raziskovanjem in mogoče tudi z nekim javnim kritičnim diskurzom o prostoru, predvsem varovanje tega, kar že obstaja. Plečnik je velik arhitekt ne zaradi svojih neuresničenih načrtov, ampak zaradi vsega, kar mu je uspelo realizirati. In tudi sam sem v tem članku bral nekatere projekte, ki niso bili realizirani, tudi v luči projektov, ki jih je realiziral. Absolutno se mi zdi, da so njegovi nerealizirani projekti zanimivi sami na sebi. In jih ne gledam kot neke vrste dokument, ki ga je treba zgraditi, ampak je pa pomemben dokument za razumevanje že zgrajenih načrtov. Če zelo na preprost način povem, njegovi projekti za Metliko ali pa projekt za hišo pod občinsko streho, po mojem, da pomenijo, da lahko recimo na Križanke gledamo drugače, kot pa bi, če teh projektov ne bi poznali. Tako da tudi nerealizirani projekti niso neke vrste spodleteli, neuresničeni, pozabljeni projekti, ampak so zanimivi tudi zaradi tega, ker so neuresničeni in ker osvetljujejo naše razumevanje realiziranih projektov na drugačen način. Poglejmo samo zgodbo o Katedrali Svobode, ki je projekt, ki ni bil nikoli zgrajen, pa je izjemno vpliven, pojavlja se na znamkah, na dokumentih, v glavah različnih inštitucij, v umetniških projektih. Jaz ne bi mogel reči, da je to propadel projekt, ampak je živ projekt in se razvija naprej, nekaj ni bil zgrajen. Potem imamo seveda druge argumente, zakaj je sporno danes realizirati Plečnikove projekte. Prvi projekti za NUK so bistveno slabši ali pa manj posrečeni, manj prepričljivi kot ta kasnejši, ki je bil dejansko realiziran. In tukaj pridemo do značilnosti Plečnikovega delovanja, da razvija, pili, spreminja projekte ne samo do začetka gradnje, ampak tudi v času gradnje in potem za njih še izdeluje načrte po zaključku gradbenih del. Številne njegove cerkve so bile gradbeno zaključene v nekaj letih, oprema se pa potem dopolnjuje še desetletja po njegovih načrtih. Skratka, ker dela Plečnikove projekte tako kvalitetne, zanimive in drugačne, je, da se z njimi da jih obravnava kot procese. Če vzamemo enega izmed nerealiziranih načrtov in ga danes zgradimo po teh pomanjkljivih, ne do konca izdelanih izvedbenih načrtih, pomeni, da v bistvu zidamo dokument. Zidamo nek ne do konca prignan projekt. S tem zgubimo to procesno kvaliteto Plečnikovih načrtov, zgubimo možnost, da bi avtor sam prilagodil, spremenil, se poigral s tem projektom, da bi ga izpilil do konca, in jaz mislim, da ni naša naloga zidati nek v času zamrznjen dokument. Tretji argument, zakaj je to problem, je po mojem dejstvo, da se dostikrat Plečnikove nerealizirane projekte danes uporablja za argument, zakaj bi se delali neke sporne stvari. Recimo, za konkreten primer tukaj v glavi imam glede Plečnikovega štadiona, ker so bili poznejši Plečnikovi načrti kako naj bi ta razmeroma preprosto zasnovo Plečnikovega štadiona za Bežigradom nadgradil z novimi strukturami, ki so ga zagovorniki Bežigradskega športnega parka uporabljali kot argument, saj bi Plečnik sam, če bi bil takrat denar pa volja, naredil drugačen stadion, kot ga je. In po mojem, da je to zelo zanimiv argument, absolutno se z njim ne strinjam, ampak kaže na dve različni razumevanji Plečnikove dediščine. Eno je, da je Plečnikova dediščina svet idej. Skratka, da so ti njegovi načrti prikaz še boljših, še mogočnejših idej, ki pač v Ljubljani 20 pa 30 let niso mogle biti realizirane in da je naša naloga, da te projekte realiziramo. Moje prepričanje, pa prepričanje številnih drugih, je pa seveda, da je Plečnik zanimiv, intriganten in tako kvaliteten avtor zaradi stvari, ki jih je uspel realizirati, ki dejansko tukaj že obstajajo. In ne želim si, da bi Plečnikovi nerealizirani projekti postali izgovor za to, da porušimo, uničimo ali pa prezidamo njegove realizirane projekte. In tudi jaz včasih znajdem pred skušnjavo, da bi se z veseljem sprehodil po zgrajeni katedrali Svobode, recimo, ali pa da bi rad videl, kako bi v prostoru dejansko izgledal Plečnikov magistrat, če bi bil zgrajen na mestu današnje tržnice. Ampak mislim, da smo toliko zreli, da se lahko zavemo, da je Plečnikov opus zgrajenih in nezgrajenih projektov tako bogat, da je naša primarna naloga predvsem varovati to, kar je bilo zgrajeno, in se raziskovalno ukvarjati tudi s projekti, ki niso bili realizirani, namesto da se prepustimo skušnjavi podirati realizirane projekte in graditi nerealizirane projekte. Po mojem, da smo, če se prepustimo tej poti, močno zašli in v bistvu izdali Plečnikovo dediščino.
So you wrote this article with Mirjana Lozanowska. Who initiated the creation of the article and how did the collaboration between you two take place?
Well, it was, we met with Mirjana, I think, more than 10 years ago, maybe, yes, 10 years ago. I was working at that period I was assisting teaching at the Department of Housing Design and residential buildings and collective housing design in Skopje, in North Macedonia. And Mirjana had she was visiting the school. I think she was delivering some lecture the second time that she came. And we met there. So my professor, then Minas Bakalchev, introduced us to each other. And I don't know, at that period, I was working as a researcher for her for another project. It was related to the Skopje earthquake. Mm-hmm. And then we stayed in touch, and she reached out to me because she knew that I was in Slovenia. Mm-hmm. And she, I mean, we were speaking about doing this a long time ago. We just didn't know in which direction to move. Yeah. And she came up with this idea of writing something about Grabrijan through the lens of, you know, how did he relate to the Macedonian house, and how was it possible actually to write such a because there were a lot of drawings, to compose such a beautiful book from only a few trips to Macedonia.
And why do you find Grabrijan relevant?
He's showing how these design principles, he's encouraging that these design principles are interpreted in the newly designed architecture, in the newly designed houses at these particular places. So it's somehow there's a design-driven element. It's not just passive documentation of an architectural heritage, but it's also, okay, we see this element, we see the chardak, this veranda, we see the vertical spatial walk between different rooms. how can we translate this into the new house, that it's appropriate and welcoming the needs of the contemporary citizen, you know, in that way. So this is what I find relevant about Grabrijan.
So your research is based on Grabrijan studies from the mid-20th century. How do you think those studies could be continued today, and which methods would you use?
I think that a good thing would be, for a beginning, maybe just to make some, how to say, new and more organized order in the archive itself. And again, it depends. As I mentioned, he wrote many articles and books, but there are also some of the projects that he designed. I would simply, I don't know, love to work on a book that relates to everything that he did. Not just this research part and his publications, but how did he, I'm just very curious to understand how did his research influence his design decisions as an architect. I know where he was designing this, so mainly in Bosnia and Macedonia, and there is a list of projects. This is Blaž Rotar. In his diploma thesis, there is a very clear list of things. And regardless if they were built or not, I think that they should be put in a particular book.
So which part of Grabrijan's methodology in researching vernacular architecture do you find most innovative or useful for contemporary studies?
His overwhelming desire to recognize living principles within the traditional houses that can be translated in a contemporary language.
And also, I would like to ask you, what would be your advice to architects and urban planners who want to better understand and incorporate traditional architectural principles into modern design?
Advice simply to be open. I think that it's really important to, one thing, it's to devote enough time to site research, and this physical and visible characteristics of the place. Another thing are these invisible layers, like historical background, what was happening there, how many different meanings this particular place is holding in itself, and also the position of that particular parcel in the wider context of the city. So maybe simply just zooming in and zooming out. But I think that this transtemporality is really important thing to implement in design thinking, because it's not, traditional architecture is not something happening in the past, but we need to find a way how to relate to it, particularly in the school of critical regionalism. I mean, buildings that are that have a, how to say, gentle relationship with the place. There is a very meaningful dialogue. I don't know how to explain it, but the existence of the building establishes a very beautiful dialogue with the site, with the landscape, with everything. Another dimension is the actual needs of the participants, the inhabitants. So I think we do not need to be afraid of just getting into dialogue with them. Like, for example, we won an architectural competition for athletic stadium, and as girls, like we were women, we deal with sport, but very basic things. And we reached out to Olympian. So the things that he shared were really meaningful. And we won the competition because I mean, it's one thing to read about these things in I don't know, Neufeld or other design manual. It's another thing when you hear the embodied experience of a particular person, and I think that you just need to have the right amount of defamiliarization and estrangement. So you need to be far enough to critically to critically observe things, not to be too emotional, and on the other hand, to be able to imagine living through the experience of the particular citizens or users of the place.
So thank you for your time. It was great meeting you and talking to you. And yeah, bye.
Hello. Hi. It's very nice to get in touch with you now, and thank you so much for taking the time. So I'm going to be asking about the DUŠAN Journal 72 that you wrote an article about. We won't lose too much time, and I can go ahead into the questions.
Yes, please.
Yes, and this one is a little bit more playful, and it's about JOŽE PLEČNIK. In the text, there is mention of him being very effective because of his veneer-like way of designing and observation. So both Grabrijan and Bogdanović admire JOŽE PLEČNIK in some way. Do you think his success in urban interventions came from his ability to work at the pedestrian scale, focusing on small human-centered adjustments rather than large-scale urban press? In contrast, do you think conventional master plans are a little bit too abstract and two-dimensional, lacking the spatial and sensory depth that PLEČNIK maybe had?
I totally agree with that. And I think that's a specificity of GRABRIJAN, because basically was PLEČNIK's pupil as a god, so at least was within his circle of people. Now Bogdanović, I think he picked PLEČNIK more on an elective way. Bogdanović sensed the importance of the pedestrian, so this direct relationship between the city dweller and the built environment. But I think that why PLEČNIK was so important for Bogdanović is because Bogdanović was somehow afraid of the all over and the all spread mechanization. He was really more into analyzing the natural growing of the city, how the mechanized building and construction of the city was dehumanizing the city dweller. That's why PLEČNIK was so important for him. And secondly, because the public spaces were really able to identify a scale. And I think that's why it's so interesting to me personally now, is really the establishment of this scale of appropriateness, as I would call it. He has this incredible ability to combine monumental elements, but to scale them down or scale them up in a way that it's absolutely adequate for the city and the natural context he's building in. So I think that Bogdanović was really into that, making resurface this ability of the architect to reshape the built environment, but not using elements that came from the machine. PLEČNIK, somehow, he didn't perceive himself as modern or anti-modern, no? And in a way, Bogdanović had the same, that there was this very interesting speech he gave at SANU, Serbian Academy of Science, where he said, by becoming an architect or in choosing the memorials, I didn't choose not the modern and not the non-modern, I choose the eternal. And I think this idea of the eternal is something that has to do with PLEČNIK as well. It's the human scale. So the scale and the appropriateness of scale has to do with the human body, which basically I think has been unchanged for centuries.
Of course, and is also, of course, imperceivable if you're not at that scale observing and walking like he was.
Exactly.
And I love this about scale appropriability. Is probably, I like that a lot. Okay. And the last question was probably the most intriguing one for me. And it's regarding exactly like how I also said that Bogdanović was afraid of mechanization. He was also afraid a little bit of, I felt, modernization and its universality. The last question is about this critique of modernist architecture through the text, particularly the tendency to ignore local context. And it made me think about how modernism has been interpreted in other places. So they were both critical of modernist urban developments in Yugoslavia for their detachment from historical and cultural context. But do you think that their values, the ones they're describing in the text, were successfully applied to modernist architecture elsewhere in the world, through still being somewhat, still copying somewhat? Has modernism in certain regions evolved to be more specific and responding to local traditions? Or is it inherently in its core too resistant to such adaptations because it's too universal?
First of all, I would say that we maybe get the wrong perception about modernism, because the more you study, and I think that's why it's important to study Plečnik and Bogdanović, because I don't perceive them as anti-modern. I think there is the vanguard, and okay, there are those architects that are radically modernist, that also even Le Corbusier, in the post-war, he somehow softened his lines, changed some things. So the universal message was not so abruptly against the local and the localism. For instance, I'm here in Italy now, and Italy it's really the place where this modernism, this locally adjusted modernism somehow developed and worked in opposite tendencies. So you have the tendency towards a more rationalist approach, and on the other hand, you have some more Italianate style, which then moves into a more monumental aspects and features. This universality and this claim for universality was actually not so radical, that actually we have some features that have to do with materials, with very shallow things like the building, the construction sites, the people working on the construction site, that somehow introjected some aspects of the local. If we think about Bogdanović, he had a claim against a prefabrication, for instance, now. But I don't see that his houses, for example, for the Jaroslav Černý Institute in the 50s, that were built with stone claddings, are so different from the Mediterranean houses. As a matter of fact, and I think that's also Plečnik, by the way, this proximity to the Mediterranean world, to the Mediterranean culture, somehow influenced also architecture. So I think that this locally adapted modernism or anti-modernism existed somehow.
So not only abroad, but it even got established somehow in former Yugoslavia now.
Yeah, I think so. Because I also think about Dobrović, the houses of the 30s in the area around Dubrovnik, massive use of concrete and stone. But then the post-war, where this, the presence in the center of Belgrade of Dalmatian stone, it's something has nothing to do, with the local, but there is this tendency towards universalism, but universalism that was close to their, let's say, native culture, or to the culture they experienced through their professional life.
Okay, thank you for the extensive answers, and I found them really interesting. I'm really happy you took a lot of time for all the questions, which is really nice. So thank you again for taking your time.
Doviđenja. So,
yeah.
Vidimo se.
Yeah, vidimo se.
Hello, Daria. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I really appreciate your insight for my project. Now, I would like to dive into the questions. My first question is, what inspired you to research the early work of Juraj Neidhardt?
So in my work, I have often dealt with architects of the same generation to which Juraj Neidhardt belongs. So this is the generation who gained or established itself during the interwar period, and this was the time or the golden age of public architectural competitions, where young architects could present and affirm themselves. And that's how I first met Juraj Neidhardt's work, through his conceptual or competition projects and writings. So in 2005, I was in Fondation Le Corbusier in Paris, and I did the research on Corbusier's associates from Croatia in the 1930s. And there were three of them: Zvonimir Kovačič, then it was Ernst Weissmann, and then it was Juraj Neidhardt, the third one, with his avant-garde projects, at the time published in French professional press in the 1930s. and who would be known after the post-war for his Sarajevo work. So I went backwards with Neidhardt. I first knew his architectural avant-garde projects, and then I went back to born and bred in Zagreb. So I really wanted to further explore his work for Zagreb. In 2007, I edited the book Modern Architecture in Croatia in the 1930s, and with 100 examples of modern architecture from all over Croatia. And the series of work presented in the book in chronological order begins with Neidhardt's Archiepiscopal Boys Seminary from the late 1920s, that was the first time I wrote about this work, because it was an example of ambivalent architecture, I can say, but it's probably not right, turning point. And it was towards modern movement and functionalism, which will lead towards. So since Neidhardt participated in numerous Zagreb competitions with memorable projects, and in post-war period too, he reflected on the development of the city of Zagreb very often, I was really glad that we also have preserved this building, this huge ensemble in Zagreb, because after seminary, he never built anything in Zagreb. He was very popular as idea maker. His projects are very present, but nothing stayed. Comparing to other architects of his generation, we can say that he was in his 20s. He's already realized or constructed this huge ensemble, which is a little bit isolated in Zagreb, but it's still there. It's very nice. It's very, you can feel strong movements, how he assembled all this together. And at the time, his generation still worked with well-established architectural offices in Zagreb, like assistants, etc. So I think it's huge that he built this when he was 25.
That's actually really impressive. So, and while studying his work, did you come across any unexpected findings?
Maybe with age, I can say he breaks down the building according to a specific function, specific building, and spatially unites all these organisms that can really function as a small independent city, which is great. And also what I like, this large complex is very well connected to surrounding terrain, the environment, etc. It's all, he built this, ensemble as a spatial whole. So I learned how to appreciate how Neidhardt, while working on a specific topic or task, used to take a step back usually, and have a bigger picture of the project, of the task, architectural task he tried to achieve. So I think that this approach was first tested here in Zagreb on this location, on this project. Later on, he always writes about other things, not his project only, which is great. And he tries to connect his own projects, especially for some urban or some ideas for Zagreb later on. He tried to connect the existing architecture and the environment with his own, project. So it's never alone, me, or my house, It doesn't stop with his project. So I like this, that he stepped back to look, around and to have a logical unity, to add something to the place he tried to build something.
I agree with you. And that actually ties to my final question. In your opinion, what can contemporary architects learn from his work?
So I think no big messages, only small messages. So Neidhardt's saying was that the world rests on small things. On one hand, I explained that he had huge, movements when he was planning. But on the other hand, he was really very simple guy who really appreciated very basic things. So, but I think this is also went with the generation, especially after the Second World War. So, small things. Here, search for humane affirmation of space was always in the center of any architectural task. So, vital, physical, psychological functions of people, and he repeatedly emphasized this, basic idea. This is where he was close to folk architecture too, basics. But what is also nice, he said that architects, of course, try to establish something lovelier or better for people to live in, to work in. But also those spaces after shape the people which are inside. So it's a two-way, two-edged connection. So you intervene in some space, and then this space shape you afterwards. And also, which is typical for the generation, and he underlined this several times, it's that he pointed that the great responsibility architects have while doing their job. What I like with Neidhardt, he was never isolated his own projects. He wasn't a diva, with architecture, it goes a lot of vanity. And I think he was on the opposite side of it. He shared his thoughts without any reservation. Mm-hmm. So I knew his project. We all knew of my generation when we studied, because he was so different. All these ideas for Zagreb were so brave, but also very logical. Nothing, it wasn't an excess. It was always something humane, basically humane, but also big ideas. He wasn't small. Even in this article I mentioned, there have great details, this Archbishop's seminary for boys, but he didn't lose himself trying to achieve some nice details. It's all in big brushes. Especially I like in Archbishop's seminary this staircase with half hemispheres under the stairs, which is great. It's fun also, which is also important for architecture, to have some fun, not to be so strict.
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant perspective, and especially in today's architecture discussions. I would like to thank you for sharing your thoughts, Daria, and this was incredibly insightful, and I'm really appreciate your time.
Good luck with your work.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Planning the new regulation plan for Novi Sad between 1937 and 1941. Several architects participated in it, and there were actually two calls for competition for the new regulation plan, and Yuri Neidhardt was especially important here. Although in the end it was planned by Dmitry Marinkovich. And at this time, a very important document was Athens Charter 1933, which highlighted the key principles for urban planning and had a great influence on architecture and urbanism of the 20th century, especially in Europe. So there can be many connections between the Athens Charter and Neidhardt's planning. So my question is, how did Neidhardt's planning of Novi Sad follow the principles set out in the Athens Charter, or did he even refer to it? Were his plans in the line of the functionalities approach as presented in the document?
There is a consensus that it was done according to the Athens Charter because it was primarily implementing the zoning principle.
Yeah.
But this can best be seen in his proposal for new residential suburbs and even for a new industrial zone. even though we didn't write about that that much. But those suburbs were, I think, the most interesting aspect of his, not only his regulation plan, but for his later changes in the plan for the city from after 1937, after the regulation. Because we also wrote about what happened in that short time span between 1937 and 1941. It's incredible how much happened in so few years in terms of development and changes of ideas, and then immediately after the war, another plan and another one. But anyway, residential suburbs, some variation of maybe the 19th century garden city theme topic. But it's a pity that we don't have more about this, because the garden city is only implied from the overall regulation plan, general plan. We don't have a lot of details. There is writings about that, I think, by Neidhardt and by others who were trying to interpret the garden city, some interesting idea about the front yard, the backyard, the urban gardeners. So yeah, I think the Neidhardt legacy would have been much stronger in Novi Sad if this theme of garden city and what he was actually proposing for Novi Sad was more elaborated and more illustrated.
I just want to add the specific situation about the regulation plan of Novi Sad, because it was mostly the reconstruction of the urban matrix. So it wasn't kind of, there is not too many parts, like as Bede said, like suburban areas are planned like new, but the main topic for the city was the reconstruction of the old urban matrix, and in that case, all of the urbanists from the competition actually tried to solve the problems, especially about the traffic and especially about the railroads which cross the urban matrix on several points. So it wasn't like a good case for the Athens chapter to be included. So, but anyway, maybe the radicality of how the Neidhardt actually deal with really like old core of the city is something which is on the mostly on the path of the Athens chapter.
Yeah, I think when I was reading your article, it looks like he was trying to do something better and something really new that would really make better conditions for everyone in the city. And he was also, I think, looking for the bigger picture and into the future, so, and with these gardens, I think it was a great idea, because you need space, for something new. And
this concept with garden is his way of dealing with tradition, peasant citizens who just came to the city and who should get used to urban life, but not forget that they came from rural areas and so on. And this is something we see in every Neidhardt's plan, that he's trying to reconcile the old and the new, like old way of living, keeping a little bit of tradition or traditional life, but making it modern. I think it is the same in Novi Sad, like what we saw in his project for Sarajevo and some other projects. Like he's keeping this as a monument of the past, but putting something new which will modernize. He also writes about problems with hygiene, infrastructure, plumbing, sewer system, and so on. So he sees modernization as a way of preparing city and citizens for better life.
Also, the especially tradition in Novi Sad, that tradition of the gardening, and also like a lot of people like gardening and selling the goods on the marketplaces. It was kind of tradition in Novi Sad. So you can find the articles from the 30s which embrace that tradition, and also the low density of the urban area of Novi Sad is very crucial to that idea, because in that moment in the 30s, Novi Sad expand their administrative borders and get a really low density of the city. So practically the modernist reconstruction, after actually trying to solve that low density and somehow to connect the different parts of the disconnected city and really like spread city, spread it.
Yeah, so I think it was great that you write about it, because it's something that you usually don't hear, especially at my university. So I'm happy to know more about it. And really, thank you very much.
In the sketches from 1942, we first noticed a typological design for residential buildings that resemble a beehive. Later, Neidhardt expressed his core ideas in the Kosovo Valley project, as described in his article. Would you say this represents an early form of structuralism? If so, what do you think were the circumstances that led him and other architects in the circles around Le Corbusier to arrive at a similar conclusions? That would be the first question.
Okay, thank you for this question. I must say it's a very logical one. I was thinking about it while I was studying the Neidhardt's housing projects. But my answer would be no, surprisingly. But that's only my opinion. We can discuss about this. I would say that the early sketches from 1942 are interesting because the form is unusual for the time, right? 42. But I think that the ideas behind the forms of Neidhardt beehive configuration and those of structuralists like Allison and Peter Smithson, Candilis and Jošić and Woods, etc., are not the same. Of course, there are formal similarities. They are coming from modular thinking and also from the relations between the scale of architecture and the scale of the city. But I think that the bottom line, our ideas are not the same. For example, if we try to understand the structuralist ideas, the core idea is movement. And I think that's actually the main difference between Neidhardt's projects and structuralist projects. Allison and Peter Smithson had this idea of streets in the air, and Candilis, Jošić and Woods had the concept of stem and web. And the driving force was the continuity of pedestrian and vehicle movement through the city, connecting the scale of the house with the larger environment. This infrastructure for movement was really continual and was the connecting driving force. But if we carefully examine the Neidhardt projects, the form, beehive form, is very similar, for example, to both the
projects and concepts I mentioned, Smithson and Kandilis-Joršanić and Woods. But Neidhardt's structure is designed by the separate buildings. Each building has the separate vertical communication. They are attached to each other, but there is no continual pedestrian movement, and each building is still a separated housing community for itself. So I think that that's the really important difference between this structural megaphor thinking and the Neidhardt thinking. For example, if we remember, I always used for Mexico-Maki theory. If you know the book Investigations in Collective Form, it's very useful. Maki said that there are three approaches to collective form. The first one is compositional one, very usual for Le Corbusier's time. And the other one is megastructure, like the structuralist approach. I think that Neidhardt stayed Neidhardt stayed in the Le Corbusier frame of mind, even when he was designing the Beehive configuration. He was still thinking in the composition of separate buildings. Of course, he was searching the bigger density, and he connected them to each other and made this very dynamic form. But he was not thinking like structuralist at all.
Bosnia and Herzegovina tourism axis was important for connecting culture, nature, and tourism development. How do you think this project has influenced the way we see tourism in Bosnia and Herzegovina today?
I would suggest, in order to fully grasp the importance of your question, we should start first talking about not tourism development, but development in general. And the way in which modern architecture operated in this development, not only because it's one of the most important questions of architectural history that will never be closed, but because it really deeply affects and marks the work of Juraj Neidhardt. So not only his design practice, but also his theoretical work, which is best represented by the great book he authored together with DUŠAN GRABRIJAN, which I have here, because I know you wanted to see some primary sources. So I think this book needs to be shown, absolutely. And note that already in the title of this book, Architecture of Bosnia and the Way to Modernity, we can kind of sense this tension. So what they're asking there is how to transition from this immense value accumulated historically in the geographic region, in this case of Bosnia, but also in general, to the place of modernity, which is, this place of good modernity, this place of, modernization that is balanced, where we feel, at ease with it, where we feel in harmony with it. So this is basically what the goal was. And what we see here is this tension building up between, on the one hand, the beauty, the strength, the lasting energy of these cultural and natural landscapes which were united, and on the other hand, the economic imperative. So there are these two on two different sides, and the economic branch, which is most capable of very directly kind of tapping into this as a resource, is tourism. So no other economic branch really is able to market and sell the specific environmental experience, be it of the region or of this, spectacular architecture that we see more and more built around us,
it's tourism. So this is why tourism is so key, so important. And to answer your question more directly, even if I don't think that this project of Neidhardt's really is the direct reference for the way in which we observe tourism nowadays in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it absolutely is a kind of a map, of the state of affairs, which emerged probably sometimes at that time in the 1960s and is still very, very relevant. So I think that in that sense, still today, if you want to preserve regional landscape, you need to make it a part of a tourism strategy. You will best do it by making it a part of a tourism strategy. Still today, if you want your architecture to be relevant to tourism development, you will best do it by connecting it in a meaningful way with the regional landscape. So I think in that sense, it is still very relevant and instructive for us to research it as a historical, an architectural history.
Neidhardt saw tourism as an important part of developing a region, but today tourism can harm the local environment if it's not done in a sustainable way. How do you think we can design tourist places that stay true to their local character and also protect nature?
Something you mentioned, but if you can explain it.
Yes, of course. Now what you're asking is also a little bit refers to Neidhardt's design strategies and his ways of approaching this problem, which is a proto-sustainability, I feel, in a way, sustainability avant la lettre. So what I want to first say is, if we want to learn from Neidhardt, from his the way in which he designed, I think what we first need to do is de-romanticize Neidhardt, because for a very long time, scholars have romanticized Neidhardt, this is what I feel, by interpreting his work primarily as, this celebration of built heritage, this unification between the old and the new architecture and so forth. And in my research of Neidhardt's work, I found that he's so much more than that. So make no mistake, of course, Neidhardt is in the first place, his work is marked by this great respect and infatuation with the regional landscape, with the cultural natural landscape. But he is, he's this poet of the landscape. And I think I want to show again some of the projects of the 1960s that I'm writing about in my paper that really show that he's this poet of the landscape. He's a sculptor of the landscape. He's also the scientist of the landscape. We know that he pioneered the usage of ethnography as one of the first, for the first time, as a method of architectural research. But at the same time, Neidhardt is also manager of the landscape. He's planner of the landscape. He understands landscape as a kind of political technology. So it's not only about art, it's also about integrating this art into a meaningful system of modernization. So I think if we want to extract some design advice from Neidhardt's work, we should focus on two important forms of agency, which we architects, we have lost during the last couple of decades. One of these is returning to careful and respectful mapping of regional landscape. This is absolutely one of the most obvious and important ones. The other one, which we also see in this tourist taxes project, is that we need to reclaim the large-scale imagination. So this is something that also is so important. We are not anymore that frequently planners as architects, but still, in our conceptual research, we need to think on a large scale, on a geographic scale. So I think if we manage to have agency, collective agency as a profession on these two different levels that we have neglected, I think that we will certainly reach a more substantial, more authentic, more artistic even form of sustainability in tourism, in architecture related to tourism, but also without.